All right, welcome. This is Ben Waddell again. This is our first module, and this is what I call the rundown. So every single module, we will have a group of readings, both academic press readings, as well as academic intellectual readings that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. And I will also have you watching films. And so between those three things, we'll be trying to, really try and understand the issue that we're looking at. So this module's issue is inequality in Latin America. And what we'll be trying to understand is how inequality helps us better understand migration to places like the United States. And so let's go ahead and get started. So inequality in Latin America is high. In fact, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. And if we look at images like this, which is an image out of South America that looks at the juxtaposition of high inequality right next to opulence or wealth, we get a sense of what inequality is in Latin America. Inequality is more than just numbers. It is the lack of opportunity structures that people face as a result of deep inequality. The people on the left hand of this image, for example, have opportunities that are very reduced in terms of education, healthcare. They live in very close proximity with each other. They lack things like air conditioning or recreation, which you see on the right-hand side. The folks on the right-hand side have access to private schools. They have access to healthcare facilities that are state-of-the-art, although private and thus only accessible to people with money. And they have access to being able to travel around the world. When we think about those opportunity structures, we can start to understand why people leave places like Latin America in search of better opportunity structures elsewhere. And so I want to go beyond the numbers and help you visualize what inequality looks like in Latin America by looking at this video about insecurity and violence in Mexico.
We cannot show you this Mexico City lawyer's face because he worries his money makes him a target. Outside, his armed guards keep watch, while security camera video is displayed on his desk.
Everyone dreams of being wealthy, but it seems like a terrible life.
It's a terrible life. It's not life. It's not life.
Gabriel lives nearly 1,000 miles from the troubled border region. Violence between government forces and drug cartels has claimed more than 7,000 lives in 15 months. But even here in Mexico City, if people are not touched by crime itself, they are by fear.
Business partners, clients, many people have bodyguards too?
Yes.
It's common?
Yes, it's common. If the authority don't protect us, we are going to protect.
Protect yourselves.
Protect yourself. Yes, that's the answer.
Gabriel employs 5 bodyguards. Each one costs about $700 a month. He fears robbery and kidnapping most. Guns drawn, they trail his armored car.
The idea of an armored car is to leave the place alive.
At Ballistic Protection, ordinary cars are armored for about $30,000 to $60,000 apiece. This year, they're planning to reinforce more than 200 vehicles.
Business is booming.
Yeah, it is. This type of business is booming now. And it's okay for us, but it's sad for the country.
Business is also up at the bulletproof clothing store Miguel Caballero, where custom-made leather and suede jackets are lined with armored plates. They sell hundreds a year at $2,000 to $6,000 each. It's security for the super rich. No one knows exactly how many kidnappings there are here in Mexico, in part because many are never reported to police. But the saying here is that kidnappings have become more democratic, that it's no longer just the super rich that are targeted.
In Mexico, they're kidnapping all the classes.
Jose describes himself as an average middle-class business owner who could not afford bodyguards.
They knew where I live. They know that I have 2 kids. They know where was my office. They know the cars that I drove. They know my whole life.
6 months ago, kidnappers abducted him at his office. Blindfolded, they held him for 15 days. His wife negotiated his release and recorded the chilling phone calls. In one, a kidnapper tells her, "If you don't do what you're told, I'm going to beat him up," and starts sending you his fingers. Negotiating often does not work. Near Mexico City, a brazen firefight sparked after police stormed a house when kidnappers refused to give up. Jose's kidnappers are still on the loose. He lives in fear and in hiding.
Right now, I'm free, but I'm also kidnapped.
As a drug war over turf and trafficking escalates here, so do jitters. As an anxious nation asks, how much worse will it get?
Inequality reduces opportunity structures for all people in society. It clearly reduces opportunity structures for the man that has to drive through the city in an armored car or transport himself from home to office in a helicopter. But that is more of an inconvenience. For folks that live in Latin America and live on the other side of inequality, that live in deep poverty, their ability to access education, healthcare, and meaningful employment is greatly reduced as a result of high inequality. What that does, in essence, is it reduces an individual's ability or incentive to participate in the formal labor market. And this helps us understand that second reading by Alejandro Portes, who demonstrates that Latin America has a massive informal labor market. Now, people participate within the informal labor market, but in doing so, they put themselves at risk because if you get hurt or if a natural disaster like an earthquake takes place, you could lose not only your employment, but your ability to eat from one week to the next, literally overnight. And so people's incentive to participate in the formal labor market or even the informal labor market starts to be reduced. And what happens is we get perverse incentives to participate in other forms of economic activity. And this brings me to the strain theory, which I think helps us understand both migration, organized crime, and violence in Latin America. So the strain theory is a theory that was proposed by Robert Merton, a sociologist from the 20th century, who was really interested in theorizing about why people commit crimes. And what he had to say about this was the following. Robert Merton thought that if you had the cultural goals in front of you, that is, you knew that people in society placed high value on having a house, a car, a stable family, but you lacked the institutional means through which to achieve those goals, such as gaining a meaningful education and accessing labor markets that are legal and formal, then you might find ways to innovate. And he called this innovation, which you can see in that red box on this chart. He called that the means through which people reject institutional means through which to succeed in society, like getting an education, and yet nonetheless accept cultural goals. One way of thinking about this is thinking about your classic cartel member or the boss of organized crime, right? So Al Capone or Chapo Guzman, the infamous Mexican drug cartel member who is now in the jail in Colorado. Chapo Guzman, among the first things that he purchased as he got into the drug business were cars, nice homes for his family members, the classic things that you would imagine other people who pursue a legal path would also purchase. And so Robert Merton said that under the right conditions, if people don't have access to the institutional means through which to succeed in society, they will find ways to innovate. Now, in some cases, people will even rebel. And the box outside of this, right, this rebellion box, is where people create new means and actually have new cultural goals established. And that would be like revolutionary Cuba or revolutionary Nicaragua in 1979. And we could see a bit of this today, and we'll talk about this at the end of the rundown. We'll talk about protests in Latin America today, which are all-out protests throughout the region that are asking for massive change in the way society is structured. So related to Merton's strain theory, in Latin America over the last 2 years, we've seen massive protests that have really been pushing back against this high inequality and poverty within the region. And we've seen this in places like Chile, we've seen it in places like Nicaragua, we've seen it in Venezuela, we've seen it in Bolivia and Ecuador and other countries across the region. I had the opportunity of living through this, or the privilege, I suppose, of witnessing what this looks like back in 2018 when my family and I were living in Nicaragua and massive protests began against the current president and dictator of the country, Daniel Ortega. In 2018, hundreds of thousands of people poured out into the streets to call for an end to the government in Nicaragua. They were violently repressed. Hundreds of people were shot out of those protests by snipers. And the end result was thousands of people leaving the country, including my family. And so when I watched that, it became very clear to me that one of the things that inequality does is it reduces opportunity structures to such a low level that individuals feel the need to protest against their governments to call for change. And when that doesn't work, what people resort to is really fleeing for their lives, right? And so in 2018, 70,000 people initially left Nicaragua, and since then, over 100,000 people have left the country. In fact, since moving back to the United States, I've been working closely with immigration lawyers, and I've been writing professional testimonies for Nicaraguans that are seeking political asylum in the United States. So this is the rundown for our first module. I hope that you've enjoyed the material that I prepared for you during this first module. The idea of this rundown is to really think carefully about the relationship between inequality, violence, and migration out of Latin America. So I'm looking forward to our next module. I hope that you're ready to dive in.